I'd let folks in from the waiting room. You can get started, Sean.
Okay, great. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for the second annual Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. I'm Sean Gio. I'm the Policy Director at the Partnership for Strong Communities, and Kaylee Pratt, Senior Policy Analyst, and Chelsea Ross, our Deputy Director, are also on this session. This year, Partnership for Strong Communities is hosting this 3-day session featuring local, state, and national experts, leading conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, coalesce us around critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues in our state. You can join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag CAHC 2021 and follow us at PSC Housing if you aren't already. This session is titled Be My Neighbor in Fairfield County, ADUs and Conversions. Before we start, I'd just like to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, Melville Charitable Trust, the Connecticut Department of Housing, Webster Bank, and Rocksport Mortgage. We also have supporting sponsors, Beacon Communities, Capital for Change, CSH, Elm City Communities, Fairfield County's Community Foundation, the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, JHM Group, LISC Connecticut, National Equity Fund, and Trinity Financial. Our session sponsor for today is the Fairfield County's Community Foundation. So last but not least, just a few housekeeping items. Sessions being recorded, and we'll make all recordings available to conference attendees as soon as possible after the conference. All participants have entered muted. Please remain on mute unless the speakers ask you to unmute. If you have a technology issue, please select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and send it in the chat to PSC Zoom meetings. We'll do our best to assist you. Your speakers will let you know how they would like content questions to be submitted. With that, I'll now turn it over to our first speaker, which I believe is Melissa. I failed to ask that before we started. So Melissa.
Thanks, Sean.
I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thanks for having us here today. We're always excited to participate and with Partnership for Strong Communities, and this is our second year now participating in the conference, and we're thrilled to have the opportunity to share some of our research. So we'll dive in, pretty quickly. I'll just introduce myself and ask my colleague Marcel to introduce himself. Melissa Kaplan-Macey. I'm Vice President for State Programs with Regional Plan Association. I'm also our Connecticut Director, so I spend a lot, or most, I'd say, of my time working with all of you. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, yes, my name is Marcel Negret. I'm a senior planner with the RPA. Most of my work focuses on land use and housing issues, and very excited to be here to present some of our work pertaining Connecticut and Fairfield more specifically. Just to confirm, I'm sharing my screen. So is everybody looking at the slide deck?
Yes, good, Marcel. Yep.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks. Oh, and I heard I'm cutting out a little. I apologize. My microphone's a little funny and I wasn't able to dial in separately on this platform. So I'm going to sit very close to the screen. I'm sorry you have to look at my face so closely, but hopefully you can hear what I'm saying, which is the most important part. And Marcel will be doing most of the speaking. So hopefully that'll work okay. For those folks who don't know us, RPA is a nonprofit research, planning, and advocacy organization. We're dedicated to improving the New York metro region's economic health, environmental sustainability, and quality of life. There's our team. We like to show our faces. We like to say we're a small staff, but we punch above our weight. A great group of folks, very lucky to work with, and get to do all this fun planning, research, and advocacy in the tri-state region. Next slide. In terms of the area that we cover, so the metropolitan region in the New York metro region that we typically focus on, the 3 states, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, 31 counties, 782 municipalities. We like to point out that only one of them is New York City, so it's a big region. You'll see it's mostly Southwest Connecticut that's typically historically been the focus of our work, but increasingly over the last, I'd say, decade or two, we've been doing a lot more, up into the Hartford region and also in Eastern Connecticut. As our region and our world has gotten smaller with transportation and technology, our reach has gotten a little bit broader. Next slide. And the main issue areas that we work in are transportation, which is, I think, maybe historically what we've been best known for, housing and neighborhood planning, which is what we're here to talk about with you today, which is a major focus of our work, energy and environment, and good governance. We've been doing this work for a very long time. So we do long-range planning for the tri-state metropolitan region. We release long-range plans about once every generation. So our first plan in 1922. And next slide. And our most recent plan in 2017. And so what we like to point out is that each plan, once in a generation plan really looks at the major issues of our day. And in our 2017 plan that I was very lucky to be a part of, and Marcel also, one of the areas that really stood out was around housing affordability. And that's what the focus is on today. So making the region affordable for everyone is a very important pillar of the fourth regional plan. And the way we do our work is we set out these broad goals, we set up big policy ideas, and then in between the issuance of each successive plan, we work together with partners on the ground across the region on the hard work of implementation. So that's the research we're going to talk to today, really does a deep dive, digs in on one particular aspect of the affordability, recognizing it's only one piece of the puzzle, but an important one around ADUs and conversion. So that'll be the focus today. And just to highlight, in all the work that we do, everything is centered around our core values of equity, health, prosperity, and sustainability. So when we say make the region affordable for everyone, just some top line things that we highlight in the plan is just things I think this audience is very well familiar with that we probably don't even need to mention, but just the fact that households are extremely cost burdened. We're not building enough housing to accommodate job growth, and housing policy and segregation have long been intertwined. So these are some of the central challenges that we are working very hard to address in the plan. And that we're really looking for solutions where we have opportunities for all people to be able to afford to live in all communities, that there are options that meet a diversity of needs. And we really try and emphasize that communities with more housing choice are thriving communities, that having segregation and having unaffordable housing stock in many municipalities doesn't serve the community, that we really need everyone to have access to all municipalities in order for our communities to thrive. So now I'm going to turn it over to Marcel. He's going to talk very specifically about the ADU portion, and also just very briefly to give a little sense of how this fits into the bigger puzzle. I'll just mention we also are looking at the whole range of solutions, and one of which is transit-oriented development, which has been long been a focus for RPA. So in addition to focusing on what we can do in single-family zones, which we know constitute the majority of land in our state, there's also significant opportunity around our transit stations. So I'll turn it over to Marcel. He'll mention briefly this report, and then we'll really dig in on the topic today.
Thank you, Melissa. I just want to emphasize that some of the solutions and recommendations and ideas around housing that RPA has been exploring since decades and in the recent years as well, it recognizes a whole set of solutions. I think the fourth regional plan has over a dozen specific recommendations. So by no means, I think we're saying that ADUs are a silver bullet solution. They are definitely one part of that, of how we'll be able to meet housing needs throughout the tri-state area. So in this image, we're just highlighting one of the reports that was associated with those recommendations that had to do with looking at the potential of transit-oriented development. And so I encourage everyone to take a look at the fourth regional plan and the recommendations that have to do with that. I just posted in the chat section when folks have a chance to look into that. But today we're here to take a deeper dive into accessory dwelling units. And so as a result of one of those recommendations from the fourth regional plan, we emphasized the idea of and the potential that conversions in ADUs can have throughout the metropolitan area. And we estimated that over the long term, or by year 2040, there is potential to either legalize or build new houses that would add up to approximately 500,000 homes by creating an appropriate framework that would legalize them and create, but also provide incentives to make them a reality and ensure that the benefits in terms of housing are really aligned with the policy intent that Melissa outlined. But before we get into the actual substance of ADUs, I just want to have a general sense of where people stand on ADUs based on your perceptions. So if we could trigger the poll question for the audience, we're asking if do you support or oppose legalizing accessory dwelling units, meaning basement conversions, garages, and single family conversions as a way to provide more housing options in Connecticut. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll ask this question again to see if in any ways we've been able to, for those that maybe are skeptical, have made an influence in your thinking. Just maybe give it another minute. So I see that most people are in support. Well, that's good. And hopefully the presentation will reinforce why you feel it makes sense. I see that there's one skeptical person that says that's opposing that idea. So I think with that, we'll see if that. Let me share the results. Am I sharing the results? Is everyone seeing that?
Everyone was able to see that, Marcel. And
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so let's move on with the actual presentation. So I won't dive too much into this. There was other presentations that elaborated on the history of segregation and the role of housing, specifically the keynote presentation from Mr. Rothstein. I think that's on point. But just to emphasize, if there's a way to summarize The Color of Law, the book that elaborates on this, I think in a single image is probably this image or this meme, which I think acknowledges that both near and far from transit, predominantly white municipalities have self-segregated through various mechanisms, but most importantly through exclusionary housing rules. And this meme speaks to the values and aspiration behind the report of Be My Neighbor, which distills the idea that these zoning rules have become barriers to not only economic potential for the region, but to advancing the values and sense of community development that were promoted by the famous TV series hosted by Mr. Rogers. So, and some of the reports that Be My Neighbor that I mentioned, we also looked at the effects of redlining over time, in spite that the whole homeowner loan corporation great classification maps were produced over 80 years ago. You could still see the disparities in terms of socioeconomic and demographic trends up until this day. So in those reports, we did measure the disparities in terms of overcrowding, housing cost burden, and race and ethnicity. And you could still see a lot like those patterns that were some of the kind of the bias criteria that was used to come up with these classifications still hold up onto this age. And so that is it's not a coincidence that when we examine each of the 782 municipalities in the region, in the tri-state area, meaning that have control over land use, you can observe that the share of single-family detached homes increases in areas where spatial segregation by race, ethnicity, and income is starker. So just to highlight the specific tabulation is comparing the share of single-family detached units against race and ethnicity, and you can see that in places that have where the housing stock is composed of single-family housing, up to 90% of single-family. In those same places, white population is 86%, while Black and Hispanic population represent only 2 and 6% respectively. So it is clear, and I just want to emphasize that still has that legacy of those policies are still manifested and can be measured up to in this day. So what is the role of ADUs in all of this? So to do that, I think we have to offer like our definition or the definition that others have used in the past. This image is showing typologies based on the definitions of the American Association of Retired Persons. We're big advocates for ADUs. And so the first row shows typologies that would involve an extension or enlargement of the building envelope. So it's basically an extension, but it is attached to the primary dwelling unit. And the second row shows typologies that would retain the same building envelope and floor area. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm switching that. The first row is showing enlargements that would involve the envelope retaining the same envelope of the building. That's the second one. I'm sorry, and the first one is showing extensions that involve going beyond the building envelope. Well, but basically, these are the 6 type of configurations of detached, attached, above garage conversions, conversions of basement spaces and cellar spaces, interior upper levels, and garage conversions as a whole, not just an extension of the garage. If you look at how those might be conformed in a larger spatial unit at neighborhood level, here's an example of how that might play out. This illustration is from a Urban Land Institute report, Lincoln Institute report, advancing policy recommendations for Chicago. And so if we look at the actual typologies that exist in the region, these are a couple of examples of an attached ADU. You see the extension of the primary dwelling highlighted in yellow, the yellow dotted line. On the right, you see an example of a converted garage space. Here, other examples from Google Streets images showing, again, an attached ADU highlighted in dotted line. And the image on the right is showing 2 examples that are one each to another of converted garage spaces. Finally, these are 2 kind of different examples. This is the image on the left is a detached ADU, more typical from the West Coast in California, which has advanced a lot of ADU policy, and it took them some time to tweak it, but ultimately I think they've landed on a policy approach that works. And on the right, you see an example of a conversion from a single family to 2-family in Northern Queens. Just to iterate some of the work that we did, we estimated $500,000 for Southwestern Connecticut. We estimated that could be approximately 60,000 units, most of which could be in proximity to transit and that are better served by other types of infrastructure, including sewer or water infrastructure. And so we released that report summer of last year. We gave an overview of that presentation here, but for this specific presentation, we want to emphasize on a follow-up report that we did focusing on Fairfield County specifically. And so this was happening as the discussions around land use and housing at a state level were evolving, which was interesting to follow as we were doing the quantitative analysis of what the potential could be, what were the metrics that we had to take into account, and kind of seeing the debates unfold. So I think for that, I think it will be relevant to give a quick overview of that state legislation, which at the time was known as, I'm sorry, Housing Bill 6107, which eventually passed as Public Act 2129, which it landed mainly on having an ADU component where it mandates towns throughout all Connecticut to accept ADUs as of right. And in addition to that, limits maximum parking requirements to 2 parking spaces. So under Public Act 2129, or previously known as HB 6107, all municipal regulations pertaining land use and zoning must allow attached and detached ADUs. It also municipality should allow ADUs to be up to 1,000 square feet or 30% of the primary dwelling unit. It does not allow setting minimum or maximum age requirements for occupancy. So it's saying basically that the municipality cannot restrict it by age, or for seniors, it has to be, basically not age restricted. And as I mentioned earlier, it prohibits from setting parking requirements greater than one space per accessory unit. And then finally, it says it prohibits requiring the installation of new and separate utility connection other than to the principal dwelling. I think, and the asterisk below is indicating that there's a way for municipalities to opt out of that minimum baseline. But that has to be with a supermajority vote or 2/3 of the vote of both the local zoning board as well as the local voting body of the town. So if that supermajority of 2/3 is reached in both of those two bodies, then they could basically reject these requirements. And Melissa, you have anything to add to that process or to what the bill does, or like any insights on the debates and the negotiations that happened throughout the spring of this year?
I wasn't as close to the politics of it as probably some folks that are on this call, but I think it was one of those things in the end that's let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So to be able to get the legislation passed, my understanding the opt-out provision is included, but that it is pretty tight in terms of the timeline, and the bar being the 2/3 vote by the legislative body and the Planning and Zoning Commission. Obviously, for advocates, it's incumbent upon us to provide the education and advocacy in this year ahead. So, for towns that are considering opting out, to understand, why, and to encourage towns to really, try and embrace this, because it really is an important opportunity to create more housing diversity across the state.
Thank you. So with that, I think we could follow up with the next poll question that relates to the bill, and specifically, I think one of the more contentious points of the debate that had to do with home rule, and it's basically asking all of you, what is the level of government that has the greatest responsibility in regulating accessory dwelling units and ensuring that the positive impacts actually materialize? And when we refer to the positive impacts, I think we're referring to the policy intent of increasing housing choice and segregation and addressing segregation issues that we mentioned. And so, yeah, it's a range of 4. I see people already responding. Let's give it a few more seconds. So it seems at this point to be somewhat tight, or at least compared to the previous poll question. But there seems to be more an inclination on thinking that the responsibility is shared on both state and local level. But for the most part, most of that responsibility lies at the local level. About 1/3 of you, about 27% of you responded that most responsibility lies on the state, some of that on the local level, and one person responded that all responsibility should be on the local government. Nobody responded that all the responsibility lies on state governments. So we won't follow up with that specific question, but I think we also have some insights on that front. To be clear, just to clarify, the Public Act 2129 does not put all the responsibility of ADUs on state level, even though it's like a state framework, setting minimum standards, it really lies. I think that it probably recognizes that most of that responsibility lies on the local government, which seems to be in alignment with how most of you responded to that question. So as I mentioned, as that debate was unfolding and landing on that legislation, we were conducted an analysis that was commissioned by Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity to try to understand the potential and quantify how many accessory dwelling units could materialize as a result of this state framework. I'll go back to this specific image. But we did is an exercise of scenario planning, comparing two scenarios over the long term by 2040 and estimating the potential housing increment within Fairfield County. And so the first scenario, which we refer to as the unconstrained scenario, or the aspirational scenario, which is shown on the left, is a contrast to the constraint scenario, which assumes that some of the current zoning regulations prohibiting ADUs would remain in place. And so the way that we reach these measurements, and I'll dive in greater detail later, are based on specific geographic specific variables, mainly the housing stock, housing stock, transportation, and property values. And in addition to that, we also compare those findings or estimations against other work that we've conducted and trying to quantify the needs of Fairfield County in terms of housing. And so this chart is simply comparing the potential increment in housing and just comparing those two scenarios against households that are cost burdened by town, or at least for this image, for the county as a whole, for renters and owners, and making the distinction in light for renters, light blue for renters, and dark blue for owners. So it's a rough comparison, and it assumes that all else equal, you could meet some of the needs with ADUs in by themselves, but also to the point is that we could also see the degree to which new housing through ADUs may not meet all of the needs throughout the county. And I'll go back to a version of this chart later in the presentation. To elaborate a little bit on the methodology and the variables that we considered, where, as I mentioned, the housing stock, specifically on single family properties. And so we made a distinction between attached and detached single family. We also set a threshold, making a distinction between the size of the lot, using 5,500 square feet as that threshold to indicate lots that are larger than that and lots that are smaller than that. We also estimated the proximity to transit and making a distinction between bus service and rail stations. And we also took into account property market values, specifically making a distinction of or highlighting that the land to improvement ratio as a proxy for potential development or properties that could make use of an ADU, and that from a financial perspective, it could make sense for them to do an ADU, to build an ADU. And then we, on top of that, we baked the zoning. We created a zoning restrictions index that took into account the permitting process, occupancy requirements, and dimensional requirements. For the zoning restrictions index, we were fortunate enough to collaborate with our partnership with our partners from Desegregate Connecticut, who built the zoning atlas, which had specific variables attributed to ADUs. And so we used those attributes and that information to build this zoning restriction index specific to ADUs. And so we basically put all these things together, and that's how we came up with the two different scenarios that I mentioned. But just to go over some of the variables that we found to give some context, and I think when we're doing the mapping exercise, I think I came across that you probably all know that Fairfield County is the most populous county in the state, which represents about 25% of Connecticut's overall population, and is one of the fastest growing counties in the state. It is also closest to the center of the New York metropolitan area, or to New York City, and contains four of the largest cities: Bridgeport, Stamford, Norwalk, and Danbury, which have a combined population of about 433,000 people. And so in reference to those figures, in this image, we're showing how the size of Fairfield County compares to New York City's 5 boroughs. And yeah, it's you basically have to add, in addition to the 5 boroughs, all of Nassau County to have a land area that's comparable in size to that of Fairfield, but still you just have a fraction of the population and density associated with that geography. And so when you look at the general breakdown by land use in acres by Fairfield, you notice that about 338,000 acres are classified as residential, compared to just 21,000 of mixed use, 22,000 of commercial, and then this strictly residential usage makes the bulk of the land that's allocated in Fairfield County. But just to dive deeper into the single-family housing stock, as I mentioned, the Fairfield County Housing Needs Assessment dives deeper into the broader spectrum of the housing stock, including multifamily and below market units and affordable units. But in this report, we wanted to look deeper into single-family stock, and so this chart is breaking down the number of detached large single-family lots that are above 5,500 square feet, detached small single-family lots, or detached single-family lots that are below that threshold, and then attached single-family, and then making that decision for each of the 23 municipalities in Fairfield County. And so you can see, of course, that the majority of the single-family housing stock is composed by large detached single-family lots. And then in some cases, you see concentrations of attached single-family in the older parts of cities, the more historical parts of some of the municipalities that I mentioned, Bridgeport and Norwalk. When we look at the transit, and I think the reason for why we included this or measure the proximity to transit is it has to do with parking regulations, which are a major impediment to ADUs or new housing in general. And we're using that to inform that we're assuming that the proximity to transit would be correlated with how relaxed or in proportion to the parking requirements will be relaxed in proportion to the accessibility of transit modes, basically. So we assume that neighborhoods that are better served by rail and bus services, parking requirements or minimums will be modified to eliminate parking in some case, or in some cases implementing on-street management and maybe things like parking permit programs, which are within the scope of municipalities. And so we looked at the breakdown throughout the county as a whole, and you'd be surprised to the amount of single family units that are served by some form of transit. So close to 44% of all the single family housing stock is served by some form of transit. And that if we break it, the ones that are served both by rail and bus, that adds up to about 33,000 units, or about 14% of the housing stock of all single family residences. About 33,000 are served only by rail, and almost 40,000 are served by bus. The remaining 56% are not served by transit if you use the kind of the distances that we assumed in our analysis. And this chart is simply kind of breaking those numbers by town, and we see that towns like Bridgeport, Norwalk, and Stanford have the highest number of single-family residences that are served by those transit modes. The improvement ratios and the market values, we also took that into account for our scenarios, assuming that the market value of single-family properties and their corresponding physical improvements, not zoning, would largely determine what is considered a underdeveloped property. We use a land value ratio, which is defined as the property's assessed value, assuming that the property is vacant, divided by the total assessed market value, which includes physical improvements. And the reason why it makes sense to take into account this metric is that it could be used as an indicator to inform where and when it makes financial sense to provide assistance and subsidies to property owners seeking to build an accessory dwelling unit or conversion, and incentivizing their construction based on the annual depreciation of single family buildings. And so here is an image showing a bar chart of the mean improvement to land value ratio of single family properties by municipality. And so you could see that towns like New Canaan and Fairfield, Derry, and Wilton have a lower mean improvement ratio, while towns like Newtown, Sherman, Shelton have a much larger improvement ratio. And you could see that association, that correlation is largely associated with how rural or how urban the municipality is. Typically, with a more rural, the ratio is higher, which is interesting because it's demonstrating that the amount of investment in the physical improvements compared to the value of the land is much higher. And as I mentioned, finally, we, in order to do the comparative analysis regarding the potential creation of ADUs, we developed the ADU zoning restrictiveness index. And so this score ranges from 0 to 10, where the low number indicates a more friendly regulatory environment and a higher one indicates more restrictions from zoning. So there's more details that I could share in the technical appendix or in the Q&A portion of the panel if you're interested in how we retrieve that. This scoring system is based on the attributes that were compiled by Desegregate Connecticut and in their zoning atlas. So one of the things just that is featured in the atlas and in the attribute information of that is the permitting process. So which zoning districts allow ADUs as of right, which zoning districts allow by special permits, and which zoning districts don't allow ADUs, period. And so here what we took is the zoning districts and quantified the number of single family residences that are regulated by those zoning districts. And so here we show the breakdown at the county level. Approximately 79,000 single family residences are regulated by a zoning district that allows ADUs or allows them on a conditional basis. About 66,000 allow ADUs by special permit only, and about 91,000 single family properties are regulated in zoning districts that don't allow ADUs, period. And then all of this was prior to the legislation being enacted. And so this basically is assuming that if all the 23 towns in Fairfield County decide to reverse or opt out of the said legislation, this is basically what will remain in place. But of course, we're recommending not for that not to be the case. And again, what we did is we combine all those attribute factors into one single restriction score. And so here you could see how each of the municipalities in Fairfield County rank compared to one another, with the ones in the right being the most restrictive and the ones on the left being less restrictive. Stanford and Danbury being on the higher end of the spectrum of being restrictive. Stanford doesn't allow for ADUs in any zoning district. And the more flexible municipalities are Richfield, Western, and Norwalk. We also made a modification to the index to reflect some changes that the town of Westport did to their zoning ADU ordinance. So as a result of that, their scoring system or index improved by several points. They used to be higher up in the spectrum of this chart before we kind of updated that based on those amendments. We basically took all this all this information and put it together to make the scenarios and the projections. So I think that this quote from our senior fellow for transportation, Rachel Weinberger, I love this. The future is a choice, is not a forecast. I think when it comes to housing, I think it acknowledges that while external factors will largely determine how these scenarios play out, history has shown that housing policy has been by and large a choice and not necessarily a passive prediction. I want to emphasize that the result of this analysis is not a forecast, it's rather a contrast between an aspirational vision that would maximize ADUs and conversions over the long term against an alternative that would maintain a status quo of ADU restrictions and in general housing scarcity and segregation. So just a little diagram on how all this was put together, showing basically the workflow. I'm not quite sure if you have questions, we could dive into that. But basically the aspirational scenario probably reflects a type of planning approach that is more in line with Georgism or Chupista theories that are very intentional about maximizing uses in accordance to geographic characteristics, including infrastructure and environment. You could also swap Donald Shoup with our RPA's very own Rachel Weinberger. And that is contrast against a type of planning philosophy, which I think is probably best represented in Charles Murford Robinson, who was very intentional about the class separation purpose of zoning, and some of the very earliest uses of zoning that were explicitly intended to separate exclusive neighborhoods from the lower classes. So we have a choice. Like, do we lean with like the Georges, Chupista, Weinberger kind of planning approach and maximizing use based on environmental and infrastructure conditions, or are we in favor of the approach from Robson? I think that's basically the choice that we were presented with, and so that is reflected in the analysis that we have. In the unconstrained scenario, we estimated that an additional 40,000 units are coming from new ADUs and conversions. That roughly represents an 11% increment over the existing housing stock, assuming all units, including multifamily. And the majority of these units will be located in neighborhoods served by public transit and in localities where single-family residences are underdeveloped. And the alternative scenario, the constraint scenario, shows a net increment that will be less than half when compared to the projections estimated in the aspirational vision, which is about 16,000 additional units, or about 4% of the existing housing stock. And this is how those two scenarios compare to one another per town. So you could see the incremental difference, or the difference between each of those scenarios, is highest on the municipalities to the left. Places like Stanford, Stratford, Bridgeport have the most of a difference between those two alternatives or those policy choices, while places like Weston, Sherman, Easton have much of a less of a difference when it comes to either of those choices. And so I think the point of this is that there will be municipalities that have more to gain from embracing EDU legislation at the state level, but probably going beyond that at the local level than others. So while all municipalities should still do their fair share to alleviate housing needs, some of those have more leeway maybe if they choose to maintain the standards created by Public Act 2127. And so finally, just to compare that, the unconstrained or the aspirational vision on how many ADUs could be created against the needs at the local level per municipality, this chart is comparing the potential increment against households that are cost burden for both renters and owners. And so the house cost burden is represented in light and dark blue, while the potential is shown in yellow. And so we can see the degree to which new housing created through ADUs and conversions can be part of the solution in satisfying local needs, but also in the places that you would need other things like transit-oriented development, for example, places like Bridgeport, for example, the need is so high that ADUs can only go as far. And so in those municipalities, probably you need to be much more aggressive in exploring other options. And so this really is what informed the recommendations that we have in the report. And just to quickly go over them, I want to have some time for questions. We want to make sure, we want to encourage municipalities to adopt and stick to the local ADU, the baseline, the minimum requirements that are set by the state legislation, Public Act 2129. And we definitely want to discourage municipalities from opting out and not voting against the state bill. Another thing that we mentioned in the recommendations, and I'll elaborate on this a little bit, is the importance of creating programs for technical and financial assistance, which I think is really central to the equity argument that the ADUs could provide. And without those programs, then there's definitely some limitations to the extent in which ADUs could address concerns related with segregation or in general inequality. So I think those programs are really key to really making sure that the policy intent in that regard is met. But with or without the state legislation, the municipalities should go beyond in terms of their local zoning ordinances, in terms of things like good design and accessibility, taking into account the standards for occupancy and dimensional criteria. There's language in the state legislation that talks about the dimensional criteria, but there's definitely some details that should be taken account at a local level to ensure that ADUs are in fact being able to be physically accommodated in many of those lots. And of course, like minimizing lot sizes in general. When it comes to parking standards, those can make or break ADU policies or any housing policy for that matter. So again, one of the things that is reflected in our estimations, in our projections, is making sure that in areas that have better accessibility to transit, that the parking ratios are more flexible or limited, perhaps even more than what's required by the state legislation, and exploring other options to manage parking, like on-street parking management or parking permit programs. Other places like I think Oregon has advanced curb cut fees for private driveways as a way to not necessarily as a way to capture value from that sense, but to make property owners consider if they actually need that curb cut. That's taking away some potential on-street parking alternatives. And I think these recommendations are not necessarily opposed to parking, just to the requirement of it, and particularly in areas where people would have to pay for something they may not be needing or using as much. And then finally, the assistance, technical assistance and financing assistance and information. So this is an area in which everyone could collaborate with the states, the municipalities, even at the federal government. There's been some exciting advancement in that area. to create programs that could provide assistance for construction ADUs and conversions. And that definitely should include statewide financing programs, or especially focusing on low and moderate households and senior citizens. And in general, simplifying technical language and helping streamline approvals. If you look at other resources in the West Coast, in Canada as well, there's great websites, lists of pre-vetted or curated vendors and services, from architectural services, legal services on how to build an ADU. And so all that stuff should be developed at a local level that's specific to not just Fairfield County, but probably to the state as a whole. So those are the general recommendations that we issued in the report. I don't know, Melissa, you have specific additions to any of these thoughts, recommendations?
Thanks, Marcel. No, I think this is a really comprehensive list. And we have about a little less than 10 minutes left. So I think this would be a great time to stop sharing screen, to see folks in the audience and see what questions y'all might have. Thank you so much, Marcel, for that really detailed and informative presentation. I've heard it many, many times, and I really, I feel like every time I hear it, I still get for that. And if folks have questions, we're happy to. You can raise your hand, or you can put them in the chat. And Marcel, if you stop the screen share, then I will be able to see everybody.
In the meantime, I'll be posting some resources in the chat, including the report.
I put the report in the chat while you were speaking, Marcel, so got you covered.
Thank you.
Melissa, I have a question.
Sure, Sean.
So how would you argue to towns, or what sort of points would you make them to talking to municipalities that are considering opting out of the ADU provisions?
I think the first thing in those kinds of conversations is to understand why, to really be open and have a conversation and ask, well, why are you opting out? What is it that you think is wrong or, not suitable for your town with respect to the legislation? And then, in the case of Fairfield County, where we have very specific data, have a real conversation about, what the opportunities are and what opportunities would be missed by not doing it. So, having people think about accessory dwelling units as an investment, and also who they serve, looking at the housing needs in the community across particularly its income and age. So both of those things together, what types of housing does a municipality offer, and are they really meeting the needs of their population with the housing stock that they have? And I think, in most cases, in the suburban communities, the answer is going to be no, because we know, with the zoning atlas and all the data we have now, that the majority of homes are single family, and that only meets a certain demographic and socioeconomic needs. So I think it's, it's important to be open and have dialogue to the extent that towns are willing to engage in a productive conversation. I think that's where we want to start. And, I think also highlighting the successes and letting, towns know about places that are doing a great job with this. I mean, I was really interested, in the analysis, see what a good job, relatively speaking, Ridgefield is doing, for example, right? And so just having people understand sort of what their peer communities are doing. And peer learning is also always an important aspect to this, even putting people in touch, with other towns, not just with us as advocates, but say, well, hey, why don't you talk to the first elected men in this town and ask them how it's going for them? So there's a few ways into that. And I think, being open to dialogue and having a productive conversation is always going to be more fruitful than to tell people why they're wrong.
I saw there is a question in the chat asking about how the ADUs might affect school population.
Sure, I'm happy to take it. Or Marcel, do you want to take it first, craft? Or I'm happy to take it.
I already talked a lot.
You talked a lot. Okay, I'm happy to take it. I just want to make sure folks can hear me. I know my microphone's a little wonky, so I'm going to sit close. So I think, this is obviously always an important conversation that people have with any new housing, is this concern that the school districts are going to be overrun with children and that, we're not going to be able to address it. So 2 points, one is that smaller units that are like ADUs are not going to generate a lot of school children. It's just very simple. In terms of the space that they're offering, they're not family units. That's single family homes are your biggest generator of school children. Data just shows that over and over again, people may have an idea for whatever reasons that multifamily or affordable homes in particular are going to create more school children for whatever reason. It's just the facts, the data does not bear that. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is in Connecticut, a lot of school districts have been losing population. So the idea that having more school children is a bad thing is also something to think about. We want thriving communities, like we talked about at the beginning. We want communities for people of all ages. So, trying to design communities to exclude families, is also something to think about, why that argument, why we think about it or talk about it in that way. Sort of, again, what are we losing by not providing opportunities for homes for people across incomes, across ages? That's really where we continue to pivot the conversation back. Because I think this idea that towns can't afford more school children is just a very narrow conversation when it comes to addressing housing opportunities, housing needs.
Melissa, I have one final question for both of you. I think we have time for more. Hopefully others will have questions. But I was surprised by a few things in your report, and I'm wondering if either of you were surprised by it. The two things that most stood out for me. Well, you mentioned one already was where Ridgefield sits in the zoning restrictiveness index, but the other was Stamford, and really the sort of the opportunity and sort of risk I think that we faced with Stamford not permitting ADUs. I don't know if you have any other things that surprised you, or you want to speak about either of those.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, Marcel, if you want to add on. I mean, I also, when we did the analysis, was surprised by that. But then when you look at it, it's, of course, because Stamford doesn't allow ADUs. So allowing ADUs and making it, streamlining the permitting process, making it easier to create, there's a huge demand for housing. And Stamford, is sort of this city suburb in and of itself, right? Because you have, the city of Stamford and town of Stamford, which are now the city of Stamford. So there's a lot more room in Stamford in terms of single family lots than you might think about when you kind of think about downtown Stamford. So the potential to meet housing need with this housing type is really huge, because you could open up an opportunity that currently just doesn't exist. And you have the land, you have the single family lots, so it's all there. It's just waiting for the zoning. And Marcel, I don't know if you have anything to add to that comment.
Just a small caveat on the methodology. I posted the appendix that elaborates on how we estimated the restrictiveness of that. So the chart in itself is showing the restrictiveness per town, and that's an average of all the zoning districts that are in that town. For the methodology itself, we did align the boundaries of the zoning districts with a unit of analysis, which was based at census block level. So the projections themselves are nuanced enough to reflect the specific differences across zoning districts. But for the purposes of the chart, as presented in that bar chart and ranking each municipality, that depends on how many zoning districts there are in that specific municipality. So in the case of Richfield, you might have one single zoning district. Like I think I would have to double check the map, but it seems that you have fewer zoning districts, and so that might be making it look Richfield better than it actually really is. So it's just a matter how the information is presented is based on the average of all the zoning districts, which in that chart, there's like some subtleties that may not be captured. But just to be clear, and if you want to read the appendix and for all those data and GIS wonks, feel free to check them out and reach out to me if you have questions. But those, I think we did in those calculations, we did match the different geographic units of analysis from the zoning districts so that they would match as closely as possible to the census box, which was what we were using.
Thanks, Marcel. I think Melissa will end it there. We're at the 3 o'clock hour, but I want to thank you both for all of your research and really advancing the conversation around accessory dwellings in the state and in Fairfield County in particular. Our next and final session is coming up now. It's addressing the racial wealth gap through a more equitable home buying system. I hope you'll tune into that, and I hope you enjoyed this session and the rest of the conference. Thanks again, Melissa and Marcel.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.